The Author. Written by Joshua Berthelette. And read by Christopher Roberts. Chapter 5, The Confession. The next morning, Barry Cruel stepped into the police station, feeling like a man walking into his own execution. His head throbbed, his mouth was dry, and the coffee he had choked down on the drive over did nothing to cut through the lingering haze of last night's mistakes. He clutched a folder in one hand, stuffed with letters and photographs, the proof that his worst nightmare was becoming real. At the front desk, a tired-looking officer barely glanced up from his paperwork. "I need to talk to Detective Chris Collins," Barry said, voice rough. "Tell him it's about," he hesitated, shifting the folder under his arm. "It's about something serious." The officer eyed him for a long second, then sighed and picked up the phone. A few minutes later, Barry was led down a dim hallway to a small office. Detective Chris Collins was already seated at his desk, flipping through a case file. He barely looked up when Barry walked in. "Mr. Cruel," Collins said, setting the file aside. "Big fan of your work." Barry let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Yeah. You might not be after this." Collins raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to sit. Barry dropped the folder onto the desk and sank into the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know how to say this without sounding insane," Barry admitted. "But someone out there, someone calling themselves Mr. Goodnight, is bringing my books to life." Collins opened the folder, pulling out the first letter. His expression barely changed as he read it, but Barry noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Fan mail?" Collins asked. Barry shook his head. "Look at the next one." Collins flipped to the second letter, the one with the photograph. His eyes scanned it, then lingered on the image of the woman tied to a chair, the words from the Shadowman scrawled on the wall behind her. "This is from one of your books?" Barry exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Yeah. But here's the problem, Detective." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I don't remember half the shit I've written." Collins looked up. "Come again." Barry swallowed hard. "I've been writing horror for 15 years. My early stuff. I barely remember it. I drank a lot back then. Hell, I still drink too much now." He gestured toward the letter. "If this guy is following my books, I don't know what comes next, because I don't even remember everything I wrote." Collins sat back, tapping a finger on the desk. "So you're telling me we have a lunatic out there acting out your stories, and you can't give me a roadmap for what happens next?" Barry let out a slow breath. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Collins studied him for a long moment, then reached for a notepad. "All right," he said. "Let's figure this out. You might not remember your stories, but someone out there does." He held up the letter. "And if this guy sees himself as Mr. Goodnight, that means he's got a plan. We just have to figure out what it is before he gets to the next chapter." Barry nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. Because deep down, he knew one thing for sure. If Mr. Goodnight was following the Shadowman, then the worst was yet to come. Chapter 6, The Books. Barry sat in the detective's office, his fingers pressed to his temples as he tried to remember details that were buried under years of whiskey and regret. Collins was flipping through the letters, making notes, but they were working blind. Barry had written so much, and he couldn't even remember all of it. Then, the door burst open. Sylvia. She was out of breath, her sharp heels clicking against the floor as she stormed in, a stack of books piled high in her arms. More filled a rolling suitcase behind her, stuffed to the brim with every novel, short story, and forgotten anthology Barry had ever contributed to. "I brought every book you ever wrote," she announced, slamming the stack onto Collins' desk. Barry blinked at the sheer volume of them. Seeing them all together like this made his stomach twist. He had built this world, this dark, twisted universe, and now someone was crawling out of it, trying to make it real. Collins raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of material. No kidding, Sylvia muttered, flipping open one of the books. She shot Barry a glare. I figured you wouldn't remember half of it, so we're going through it. Now. Barry exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. Jesus, I don't even know where to start. Sylvia grabbed the Shadow Man, the book that started it all, and dropped it in front of him. Start with this one. Barry hesitated, then opened it. His own words stared back at him, familiar yet distant, like a dream half forgotten. Collins leaned forward. All right, let's break it down. This guy, Mr. Goodnight, he's reenacting scenes. What's the worst thing the Shadow Man ever did in these books? Barry's fingers tightened on the pages. A cold feeling crept up his spine. There's a scene, he murmured. One where the Shadow Man leaves letters for his victims before he finishes them off. Collins' eyes darkened. So these aren't just threats. He tapped the letters on the desk. They're a countdown. Sylvia paled. Meaning there's a next victim. Barry swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. And I think I know what comes next. Collins grabbed his coat. Then let's move. Barry stared down at the book in his hands, heart pounding. The lines blurred for a moment, the past and present colliding. He had created this monster. And now, he had to stop him. Chapter 7, The Tapes. The abandoned office building loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the remnants of a forgotten world left to decay. The air smelled of dust and mildew, and every step Barry took felt heavier, like he was wading into something he wasn't ready for. Collins led the way, gun drawn, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Sylvia stayed close behind, clutching a flashlight, her face pale but determined. Barry's heart pounded in his chest. This place fits, Collins muttered. Secluded, easy to access, plenty of places to hide. Barry swallowed hard. Yeah. I would have written something just like this. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The place was dead silent, no signs of life, no struggle. Just, waiting. And then they saw it. In the center of the room, where light from the broken windows cast long, eerie shadows, sat a stack of VHS tapes. No sign of the victim. No blood. Just the tapes. Sylvia exhaled. Jesus. Barry hesitated before stepping forward. The tapes were labeled in thick black marker. Play me, Barry. His blood turned ice cold. Collins knelt down, inspecting them. Sick bastard wants to put on a show. He grabbed one of the tapes and looked around. There's gotta be a player in this dump. Barry scanned the room, his hands shaking. Against the far wall sat an old TV, the kind with the built-in VHS slot. Dust coated the screen, but it would work. It had to. Collins fed the tape into the player, and for a moment, nothing but static filled the screen. Then, the image flickered to life. The camera was shaky, the lighting dim. At first, it was hard to make out anything. But then. A chair. A rope. A person, bound and gagged. Their muffled screams filled the room. Sylvia covered her mouth. Oh my God. Barry staggered back. His mind spun as he watched, heart hammering. The camera tilted, showing a figure standing just outside the frame. The voice that followed was eerily calm, almost amused. You're watching, aren't you, Barry? Barry's throat tightened. I knew you would be. The figure stepped forward, and Barry's stomach dropped. The mask. The long coat. Mr. Goodnight. Or at least, the version his stalker had become. Collins tensed. We need to find them. Now. Barry forced himself to look at the screen again. The victim was struggling, thrashing against the ropes, but the way they were tied, Barry knew this scene. He had written it. Wait, Barry whispered. He felt like the walls were closing in. I know where they are. Sylvia turned to him, eyes wide. Where? Barry swallowed hard. In my book, this scene takes place, in a basement. His breath was shallow. We need to find the basement now. Collins was already moving. Let's go. The TV continued playing behind them as they ran, the distorted laughter of Mr. Goodnight chasing them down the halls. The game had begun. Chapter 8, The Lost Manuscript. Detective Collins flipped through the pages of Barry's books, frustration tightening his features. The VHS tapes had proven one thing: Mr. Goodnight was acting out something Barry had written. But none of it was in any of his published works. Barry, Collins said, shutting one of the books with a sharp thud, is there anything else you wrote? Something you never published? He gestured around the abandoned building. Because I've read every damn book you put out, and nothing about this lines up. Yeah, the locations match, but the details. The murders. They don't exist in any of them. Barry ran a hand down his face, his pulse hammering. I wrote a lot of shit over the years, Collins. Stuff that never made the cut. Half-finished manuscripts, failed ideas, stories that weren't good enough. His voice dropped. Or at least, that's what I thought. A silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then Sylvia shifted uneasily and took a slow step back, glancing toward the exit. Sylvia? Collins asked, eyes narrowing. She hesitated, then shook her head. I just need to check something, she muttered, already turning toward the door. Barry frowned. What the hell are you talking about? But Sylvia didn't answer. She was already leaving. Barry watched her go, something cold settling in his gut. Then he turned back to Collins. None of this makes sense, he admitted, his voice low. I've written so much over the years, always trying to outdo myself, trying to find the next great story. And I can't remember half of it. Collins stared at him, waiting. Then, like a slow-moving nightmare, it hit him. There was one manuscript, Barry murmured. His breath caught. After the burial. Collins frowned. What's that? Barry exhaled sharply, his body suddenly rigid. A story I never published. I thought it was the worst thing I'd ever written. Collins stood. We need to get back to your office. Now. Chapter 9, Sylvia's Warning. Barry's office was a disaster. The door hung open, the room torn apart, papers scattered, books knocked from the shelves, drawers yanked out and emptied onto the floor. It looked like a struggle had taken place. Collins drew his gun. Stay close. Barry's stomach churned as he stepped inside, scanning the wreckage. His desk was overturned, but something stood out, a single sheet of paper, left untouched in the chaos. Collins reached for it first. It's Sylvia's handwriting, he muttered, then began to read. Barry, I thought if I reached out to your biggest fan, he could help you get back into writing. But now we both know he's gone too far. And I think he's coming after me. Barry felt his heart stop. No. He grabbed the note, rereading it, as if the words would somehow change. His pulse roared in his ears. Collins was already dialing his phone. She left before us. If he was watching, he could have followed her. He pressed the phone to his ear, waiting. Waiting. Then cursed. She's not answering. Barry swallowed the lump in his throat. His hands trembled. Sylvia was gone. And they had to reach her before it was too late. Chapter 11, The Hunt Begins. The air in Barry's office was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Collins gritted his teeth as he lifted his radio, voice sharp and urgent. Dispatch, this is Detective Collins. We have a possible abduction and a suspect escalating to homicide. I need all available units near open fields, cemeteries, and burial grounds. K-9 units, search teams, deploy everyone. The radio crackled with static before the reply came. Copy that, detective. Units en route. Collins clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to Barry. His face was grim, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. We have a rescue mission, Barry. His voice was low, steady, dangerous. And I swear to God, if I have to put a bullet in this sick bastard to stop him, I will. Barry's chest tightened. The Polaroid in his shaking hands felt heavier than it should have. Sylvia didn't have much time. We need to go now, he said. Collins nodded once, then led the way out. As they pushed through the door, sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was coming, but Barry knew one thing for sure. If they didn't find Sylvia fast, Mr. Goodnight would finish the final chapter himself. And she'd never make it out alive. Chapter 12, The Search. The field stretched endlessly under the cold, gray sky. The damp earth clung to their boots as officers, K-9 units, and search teams combed through the burial grounds, flashlights cutting through the early morning mist. The only sound was the occasional bark of a search dog and the crackle of Collins' radio. 2 hours in. Nothing. Collins pressed the radio to his mouth, voice tight with frustration. All units, report. Anyone got anything? One by one, voices crackled back through the speaker. North perimeter, nothing. East side, clear. No signs of disturbance near the graves. Barry exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face. Sylvia was out there somewhere, and with every minute that passed, the dirt in that Polaroid felt more like a ticking clock. Collins cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. His patience was wearing thin. Damn it. He turned to Barry. This guy's playing us. He wants us running in circles while he... Barry wasn't listening anymore. His mind had drifted, back to after the burial. The lost manuscript. The sick story he had written years ago. And the ending. His stomach twisted. In After the Burial, the final victim wasn't the writer. Wasn't the editor. It was the detective. The detective who had been searching for the killer all along. Barry's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't tell Collins. He couldn't look at him. Collins was already in danger. And if Mr. Goodnight was following the book exactly, if he had read that damn manuscript, then Collins wasn't just hunting the killer. He was the last one on his list. Barry swallowed hard, his pulse pounding. His writing had led them here. His story had become reality. And now he was more terrified than ever of what would happen next. Chapter 13, Lies Behind Eyes. The search had begun to feel hopeless. Every step through the wet, uneven ground felt like moving deeper into a nightmare. But then... something caught Barry's eye. A shape in the distance. A mound of disturbed earth. It wasn't like the others. It didn't belong. His breath hitched as he stepped closer, his heart pounding in his ears. The dirt was freshly packed, uneven, as if someone had been in a hurry. And then, his stomach turned as he saw what was carved into a crude wooden plank sticking out of the soil. Sylvia Martin. Barry's blood ran cold. Just below her name, a phrase had been scratched into the wood in jagged, almost frenzied handwriting. Lies behind eyes. Barry's lips parted, his breath coming short. Lies behind eyes, he murmured. His hands trembled as he traced the letters, his mind spiraling. The words felt familiar. Too familiar. Then it hit him. God damn it. Barry stumbled back, his pulse skyrocketing. His thoughts raced, pulling him back to the second story he ever wrote, the Loomis Building. It had been an old courthouse turned into a horror landmark in his novel. The killer used it as a final hunting ground, a place where justice had been twisted into something sinister. He's there. Barry spun on his heel, ready to shout for Collins. But before he could get a word out, something yanked him backward. A sharp, gloved hand clamped over his mouth. A steel grip wrapped around his chest, dragging him into the darkness between the trees. He kicked. Fought. Tried to scream. But the sound of the officers calling out in the distance drowned out any hope of them hearing. The search continued, flashlights cutting through the night. And Barry Cruel was taken, vanishing right in the middle of a field swarming with cops. Chapter 14, The Call. The wind howled through the open fields as searchlights swept across the darkened terrain. Officers moved in tight formations, flashlights cutting through the night like desperate fingers reaching for something, someone, they had already lost. Collins stood frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly as his eyes scanned the crowd of officers. "Where's Barry?" His voice was sharp, urgent. He grabbed his radio, voice tight with frustration. "Does anyone have eyes on Barry Cruel?" Static. Nothing. His gut twisted. "Barry Cruel, are you out here?" he shouted into the darkness, his voice carrying through the cold night air. Silence swallowed the words. Collins muttered a curse under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Shit, now what? Then, his phone rang. The shrill, unnatural sound cut through the silence like a blade. Collins yanked it from his pocket, his pulse spiking when he saw the name flash across the screen. Barry Cruel. His fingers clenched around the phone. A cold, sinking feeling filled his stomach as he answered. Barry? But the voice that greeted him wasn't Barry's. It was him. Smooth. Amused. A whisper crawling under his skin like spiders. "Hello, detective." Collins' grip tightened. He turned away from the officers, his voice dropping to a deadly low tone. "You sick bastard." A soft chuckle. "I can't wait to meet you. We're going to write something great together." Collins' blood turned to ice. His free hand hovered near his gun, even though he knew it wouldn't do a damn thing over the phone. "I swear to God," Collins growled, "I'm going to end this." Another chuckle, deeper this time. "We'll see." A pause. "I'll be in touch with further updates." Collins' jaw locked. "Where's Sylvia?" A long, slow exhale from the other end. "Ah, yes. How is the search going? Are you close?" A smirk laced the words. "Or maybe not." Collins' eyes darkened. "Tell me where they are, now." But there was no answer. Just the quiet click of the call ending. Collins stared at the phone, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had just spoken to a ghost. A ghost wearing the face of a monster Barry had created. And now? Now, the Shadow Man was real. And the game had only just begun.